Hello, it's me again. The facility started using the offset Yankee localizer on July 28th on Monday, this past Monday. This is going to be a document heavy presentation showing exactly what I've been talking about in much more depth, showing from technicians, from engineers, the flight check, to a number of individuals stating, shouldn't be doing this. Meanwhile, the FAA makes statements, and I'll have a document for this as well. Well, we talked to these people, and they said that it's fine. No names, no titles, no positions, and no supporting documentation. Matter of fact, this last posting that they gave us, no documentation at all. So I'm going to move forward with that. I'm going to explain also a little bit more in depth. During the WXYZ Channel 7 newscast, they made a statement, the FAA, they're going to check with I believe they say stakeholders, which means the airlines, which doesn't make any sense to me because they're not responsible for moving air traffic. But I want to close this portion, the opening here, with some statements from the NTSB's hearings over the collision in DCA. Some employees said they feared getting transferred or fired if concerns were brought up to their supervisors. Sound a little familiar? The investigators, NTSB investigators, also pressed FAA officials over controllers who manage a DCA airspace feeling pressured to make it work due to large volume of aircraft in the airspace near the airport. Sound familiar? They also testified at the hearing that controllers sent a memo to their supervisors in 2023 requesting a lower arrival rate for airplanes, but the concerns were dismissed. Sound familiar? This is from an operations manager at DCA. I don't think this accident occurred last night. He said that at the hearing to the NTSB. I think it happened years before we talked about it. You know, resources, whether they were available or unavailable at certain time frames. Folks being listened to or not listened to at certain times. This was not that evening. It was a combination over many years that I think built up to that evening. They're talking going back to 2023 or maybe a little before that, and I'm talking about going back to 2015 where this is allowed to happen. These weren't memorandums that were sent to management. These were decisions that were made by the Office of Special Counsel, and they're being ignored. But let's close that with this statement, and we'll move on to the first segment. The first document we're going to cover is an email that Mr. Vosser sent out on October 31st of 2015. Now that date is more important than anything, although this email verbiage from the 31st of October is contained in a hotline call 2 days later on November 2nd of 2015. And how I know he probably wrote that 2015 hotline call in November is because he's using very, very similar verbiage in this email and the hotline call. And he says, unforeseen closure only 2 on the left is what they want to have. If that closes, they want to have the availability of the Yankee offset localizer to go to. But that's why I think he wrote that. But that's not for this posting. That'll be for later on when I cover this much more in depth. But right now, there's the date. The hotline call was made, like I just said, November 2nd, 2015, and he makes the statements where we will not be able to meet the arrival demand being requested by the users if they're not able to use that 2-2 right offset localizer. So the users, which are the airlines, Delta. So go figure. Capacity, then efficiency, then safety. He says that I have not, they, and the reason I say they is because the people helping me are called my recruits. Is apparently what the nickname was for us. They have not presented a valid concern to the workforce that I'm making up these safety claims. That I'm committing fraud, abuse, and waste. And then he mentions my name again, that these are not valid safety concerns at all. Then he's going to say that I'm orchestrating numerous MORs while controllers are reporting these to the supervisors. The supervisors are then making log entries, which I'll show here momentarily. The only way a controller can make an MOR is if he's actually the CIC, the controller in charge on the desk, instead of a supervisor. Then he goes on here to talk about arrivals being stabilized on a stabilized approach for 2 or 3 minutes of flight. Well, that word stabilized is going to be in one of the documents I'm going to present here momentarily. That I'm abusing the system and stuff like that. Well, the FAA answered them and made these statements here. It's a legitimate concern of safety. and I'm assuming this is my name, provided information and evidence that aircraft are the losing or not receiving the localizer signal on the Yankee offset localizer when aircraft with lower tail heights than originally thought were in the critical area. And I'm not the one who really gave that the information. These were MORs and a combined effort by quality assurance or quality control, whoever they are, and management to do that. And then they come over here and say, look, if you should close or lose runway 21 left due to FOD on the runway, snow removal, you're going to go into staggered ILSs. They were told to do that, and they absolutely ignored it. They were furious over that because the documents that, unfortunately, I didn't know that they had at the time were telling them that there was an issue. Flat out there was an issue, and that's going to be in one of the next segments down the road here. But so you can see where he makes the hotline call November 2nd, 2015, after this email on October 31st, 2015, and he was a little upset because they told him, don't do it. That's kind of ridiculous. You're not listening to your superiors and you're mad at them for making a decision, so you attack me? Again, remember, the offset localizer was never vetted or discussed in any safety risk management panel for the use of 2 runways, only 3. We'll go on to the next one. Now this document that I'm going to show you now are log entries, and it's a PowerPoint that follows it. And remember the dates I talked about, October 31st of 2015, and then Mr. Voster's then filed, and that was his email, that he filed the hotline call on November 2nd of 2015, stating that there's no evidence. He didn't have any evidence. Mr. Sugin is orchestrating all these MORs. All of these you're going to see begin in August. And they continue through October. So I have no idea what he's talking about, that there's no evidence, that there's no evidence at hand. When the FAA answered him and said, no, well, there is evidence at hand with all sorts of tail heights that are causing issues. Not just tail heights, I don't know why they hang their hat on that, but it's a hunk of metal you're putting in front of the localizer. And they were told, don't do it. Here's the evidence. This is the stuff when they said that there is evidence showing that the tail heights or wherever they said, this is the evidence they're talking about. This was handed over by the facility. Not by me, by them. Okay, so we'll start with this particular one here, and I'm going to try to go through these pretty quick because they all kind of repetitive, but you'll get the idea. This gentleman here reported not being able to see the approach lights utilizing the Yankee offset localizer. The approach lights were difficult and confusing to see. He was seconds from going around because of that. The aircraft in front of him went around. Did not capture the localizer. Not receiving the localizer. Pilot right after him reported the same thing. Had issues with the localizer. Not being able to pick up the localizer. Both reported not receiving the localizer. Last 6 arrivals had an issue with the offset localizer. Giant was doing an auto land, overshot the localizer in a 1-mile final. Pilot had to take over the controls. Now, why that's interesting and why I highlighted that is the TRACON, the radar room, is required to call the tower in the specific position in the tower that's going to work an aircraft doing an auto land. And the reason for that is we then have to keep the critical area clear regardless of weather. We have to then make sure it's clear for that aircraft to do an auto land. These gentlemen keep stating, this is safe, this is safe, this is safe. Other facilities use an offset. Detroit's the only one that goes through the critical area. So if they think it's safe, why are they calling up to the tower saying this guy's doing an auto land? That makes no sense. If it's safe, just ignore it. Doesn't matter. People in there, it's not an issue. So that's why I put that in there. Let's see here. The next one that they move on to, not receiving the localizer in a 20-mile final, the aircraft in front of them said the same thing. They had to pull this gentleman out because he didn't capture the localizer. Didn't capture the localizer. Reported he lost the localizer. Numerous aircraft said they would go around if weather was IFR due to being several degrees left of course in localizer. That's, I don't know, in localizer, on the localizer is probably what they mean. So I don't get that. Here's a weather issue being complained about the pilots. They ignore it. Did not capture. Did not capture. Pilots reported glide slope working, but getting full deflection on the localizer and reports of being 2.5 degrees offset, but the localizer appeared further left of center. Issue was ongoing for most of the arrival bank. We'll just ignore that. So the next thing we're going to cover are the PowerPoints, and why these are important is they actually have a visual effect to it, which you'll see. So Lindbergh 6251 not able to pick up the localizer. Aircraft in a critical area. That was when he was turning on to final. AC 5285 not receiving the localizer. Aircraft in the critical area. Now he then, same airplane, reported it closer to the airport. I believe it was closer. Let me look here real quick. It doesn't give a distance on that, but closer to the airport. Reported. Look, another aircraft in the critical area. Same airplane, two different issues, two different airplanes in the critical area. That's describing the same airplane there. Not a reporter not able to pick up the localizer. Somebody in the critical area. And this was a critical area, if you remember from the last video, from the last posting I did, that caused a go around, exact same area when they were landing to the north. Exact same area. Joining the localizer 17 miles out. Same airplane, but there's a different airplane in the critical area. So he's reporting numerous issues with two different airplanes in the critical area. That's just unbelievable. They just ignore these things. Lindbergh 6187. He did not think he was lined up right. Aircraft in a critical area. There you go. Reported it again. Same airplane, same report, at a different time, different airplane in the critical area. Same airplane reports it again. Same issue, different airplane in the critical area. Same airplane, 3 complaints. Then it happened to him again. Somebody in a critical area. Reported fluctuations. Somebody in a critical area. Complained about it again. Same airplane. Different aircraft in a critical area. As you can see, the exact same call sign. 2 different issues. This one here, boom, he reported it twice, but 2 different airplanes in the critical area at 2 different distances from the airport. Fluctuations, Yankee offset localizer, aircraft in a critical area. Same airplane. I just don't understand that, why they're ignoring this. Reported fluctuations, aircraft in a critical area. You can see it right there. Same airplane, reported fluctuations again. As you can see here, a different aircraft in the critical area. Don't understand how they ignore that and how that cannot be an issue. Right? It's empirical. It's here. It's right in front of them. Okay. Now these ones here, unfortunately, don't have the ground radar display that there's somebody in there. But this gentleman here said he wasn't picking up the Yankee offset localizer. They said it, but behind him, aircraft on approach saying, hey, it appeared to be fine because there probably wasn't somebody in the critical area. Same thing here. Several aircraft taxied through the critical area, and there were issues with the offset localizer. He reported that to the facility. So there you go. No data, and I'm orchestrating this. I'm telling pilots to do this. And to me, it seems like a conscious issue, right? They kept all this documentation about the math modeling, which I'm going to show, and these emails with these technicians and the engineers saying, hey, don't use this. Flight check. Well, yeah, everything's great till you put somebody in the critical area. And that's what we're going to move on to next. So I have no idea what he's talking about, that this is all orchestrated or that these are false, that there is no information out there. This information was used in response to his hotline call to tell them, do staggered approaches. Stop using that Yankee offset localizer. And he didn't like it. Anyway, we're done with this portion. We'll move on to the next. Now these next captures an email. I'm just going to briefly go over these. What was happening was the facility had removed one of the safety mitigations from the safety risk management panel, which was if the weather was forecasted to go below an 800-foot ceiling or 2 miles of visibility, they were going to cease doing the operation. They didn't like that. They removed that. I then, me and others, went to them and said, hey, look, we're going to get caught with our pants down because they're going to be aircraft that are on final, at the final approach fix or closer to the airport. There's going to be aircraft in a critical area, and the weather's going to dip below that minimum. And then we're going to be scrambling to pull aircraft off on final and try to get everyone out of that critical area before the next arrival comes that close to the airport. They ignored us, didn't care whatsoever. Also during that time period, we had been complaining that we need hold short lines, which are basically behind this airplane, that show us that when we say hold short of the critical area, after they land and turn off on this taxiway or go this way, to say hold short of the critical area, and then we know that he stopped short of it. They did a rebuild. Those lines are removed. We said, we need these back on here. The tower needs this to run this operation properly. If you're going to take away all these other safety mitigations, please don't do this to us. They ignored us. What happened was, during this incident right here, the weather went below 800 or 2. This aircraft was in a critical area. This aircraft landed, and this aircraft landed. The tower controls were all pretty young. They received poor briefings, which I've already proven that, not in this episode, but previous ones. So they were unsure of what was going on. It's a critical area, but they're like, well, where's the whole short line? They were confused. And I get that. Then it went on where that first aircraft landed, and so did this one. And then it got so bad where they just let them keep running. There it is again, another guy here with 4 of them in there. The absolute confusion that causes in the tower in a short period of time is incredible. But they didn't care. So when we complained about, hey, you didn't give us these lines, and look what happened. You took away the mitigation for the 800 or 2, look at what happened. Their email says everything. This was an email exchange between Anthony Wells, who was the manager of the TRACON back in the Detroit Radar Room back in 2015. He is now, in this instance, at the Cleveland District. He is now somewhere, I believe, in the Central Service area. And Tracy Gillen, who at one point was a staff manager who was involved in setting up using the Yankee offset localizer, so she should have known about this issue in the critical area. She was also a tower manager over at Willow Run that has a critical area. She should know better. And they're making statements like this. If there is already a vehicle or an aircraft in the island's critical area when the weather drops below minimums, can aircraft continue the approach? Do they just need to be notified of the object in the critical area? Ask any tower controller. That was just, I cannot believe the ignorance of that question. But let's move on. Mr. Wells then chimes in and says, as I recall, and I'll have to look it up for the info when I get back, but didn't we all get the explanation that if an aircraft is in a critical area when the weather drops, they can continue, and the aircraft on final does not get pulled off? Pretty sure that was the official interpretation. I'll look into it when I can. Absolutely not. There was no way that the FAA put out any sort of interpretation like that. That is an absolutely derelict statement to make, because that is absolutely so far from the truth. And these are the leadership that are directing the workforce in air traffic. I just can't believe that. Kevin Gramis, if you remember from the last posting I did about lying to Congress and knowingly running an operation, he's also involved in this, and you're going to see he absolutely makes correct statements and puts them in their place. But one of the odd things is there's somebody here from the district, right here, that was involved in this exchange. So Tracy comes back and says, this is kind of how I remember it as well, with notification aircraft on final, that the weather has dropped below minimums and aircraft has penetrated the outer critical area. I don't know why anybody would make that statement. And she was the one responsible for setting this up and directing the workforce at Detroit and the tower? That's absolutely derelict. How does she remember that? Nobody else remembered that. So Kevin then starts putting this direction in there, telling them, you're wrong, and this is why you're wrong, right? He says, from Kevin, unless there are other documents that I'm not aware of, attached is what we believe addresses your questions. This is in retaliation to localizer critical area protection. the notification part, and he goes on to state what he posted down here. And he said I believe he was probably talking to that guy at Cleveland Center and stuff like that to help him with this. But anyhow, that is an absolute correct statement. And then Tracy again attempts to answer, but the gentleman from the Cleveland district is no longer on there. We get all of that, but the main question is when the weather all of a sudden drops. All of a sudden should not be a surprise. They should be more than aware of that with forecasts, but they don't look at forecasts anymore. They just do what they want. And the tower must protect for the eyes critical area. At that time, the weather changed and aircraft was in the critical area and all others on final. Must the aircraft on final be sent around or justifies the situation? Apparently, she did not understand the direction that Kevin sent out, which was spot on. So he then finally, after putting all this stuff out to him here, have to make these statements. Just to be clear, he's not the provider of an official interpretation. That being said, I don't know what else you could do in that situation described. He is absolutely correct. Then he goes on to talk about the coupled approach and the glide slope again. If the weather drops and you cannot, for whatever reason, meet the criteria as set forth that he put in the email, with the additional restrictions as outlined in the memo, which he attached, what else can you do to protect the integrity of the critical area? Absolutely spot on. The restriction is for it to be protected when an aircraft is inside final approach fix or the outer marker. If the aircraft has the airport in sight, you let it land. If not, the only conclusion I see is to send any aircraft at that point around until you can meet the criteria that he put forth. Absolutely correct again. Where are you getting that it's okay to just provide notification? Spot on. They're making these statements in these emails again with no documents, which is ongoing with this agency. Just because it doesn't state send the aircraft around, there has to be some logic applied. Logic does not. Logic is not in the equation. It is capacity, then efficiency, then safety. If I can't protect the critical area as required, what can I control? And that would be the aircraft is on final inside the final approach fix. The premise is ensuring the integrity of the localizer signal for an aircraft following it to land in lower visibility. He is absolutely correct. Absolutely spot on. Why does a manager back then of an ATC 11 tower need that explained to them? What does somebody working in the district that was a manager at the radar room going through this mess of the localizer and worked at Saginaw Tower that has a critical area asking these questions? Unbelievable. And then they're wondering why the agency is having the problems they are. This exchange was just unbelievable. Just absolutely unbelievable. And why? Because they have to run that localizer. They have to have the triple approaches because that's what the user wants. And that's why they're doing this. And it's going to get worse here in the next couple segments of this. So let's move on. I think I beat this dead horse, and you can see exactly what's going on in the facility. The next few segments are going to cover some documentation that prove that there is considerable amount of evidence about using the offset localizer. We'll start here from March 2017, where she explains the use of it. What she explains here about the difference between a straight-in critical area and an offset critical area. Thus, the opportunity for fluctuations of the offset localizer signals increased as compared to a straight-in. After an aircraft exits the runway, he immediately exits a critical area on the straight-in when he exits the runway. But she just makes this statement as well. Complete protection of the offset critical area may significantly impact the efficiency and capacity increases expected at DTW. So there you go. We're going to ignore all that stuff she talked about. Capacity, then efficiency, then safety. This here continues in 2017 as well, with like a synopsis written by Mr. Anthony Wells to her, and Mr. Figlio was also involved in this as well, or at least received it. August of 2008, they talk about Runway 4 left localizer would be significantly out of flight inspection tolerances for both course and alignment when Group 1 and 2 are presented in the critical area. And there you go. These airplanes here are normal sized airplanes that taxi through there, and some of the examples we showed earlier, those are the type of aircraft that were causing those issues. Then in March 2011, the TRACON found out about that the math models indicate significant signal disruption under certain conditions. Didn't tell anybody in the tower, didn't tell anybody on the committee that they were involved in, that these math modelings were out there and they were showing horrible, horrible examples of what was going on. Then they talk about here again about when exiting into a critical area on the offset or exiting the critical area from a straight in. In doing so, present themselves perpendicular to the localizer signal. Well, there you go. Another example of that. Then they start talking about the large aircraft here again, about are more likely to cause navigational signal deviations in all weather conditions because of where the critical area is for the offset and normal exit points. And then they finish it with additional mitigation could be achieved by using higher threshold to protect the critical area than is what required by regulation. Well, they didn't do that. They went the opposite direction. The more and more issues that they had, they just removed safety mitigations that were weather related, ceiling height and visibility. They went the total opposite direction of what these guys said here. And then this here, when he says current, this is 2015. This is talking about the issues that I talked about earlier, all those log entries. Immediately upon its activation, the offset localizer, the facilities began receiving various anomaly reports from inbound aircraft. Right? So they were equating this while they're just unfamiliar with it. But they continue to pop up even though they did this robust awareness effort, the anomalies continued. So these are not pilots unfamiliar with it. This is issues with the localizer and taxiing in front of it in the critical area. And this is just explaining some of the information I showed earlier. Then flight check goes on to state, flight inspection noted that flight check is conducted in a sterile environment, therefore they were unable to comment regarding the potential impact of aircraft transitioning through the critical area. There you go. We asked them to do it, they refused to do it. These entities here agreed that there would always be a disruption to the localizer anytime any aircraft transitioned through the critical area. Well, there you go. So in that meeting, no party was comfortable providing an opinion that the disruptions to the signal caused by other than heavy aircraft were within a safe tolerance. So here, all the people that they asked us for, everyone's saying, hey, there's issues, we can't guarantee this. There's always going to be signals disruption. And then they go on in the summary, due to the inconsistent and indecisive feedback from flight inspection and engineering services. Did any of that seem inconsistent or indecisive? They made specific comments and specific statements about the equipment and where the critical area is located and where the array of the signals being interfered with. So are you kidding me? So you insult these guys? They're doing their job. Hey, you know what? This doesn't fit into our capacity and efficiency first mantra. So we can't have that. And then the last part of this particular issue here is one of the engineers in an email makes this statement. After he reevaluated everything, he slept on it. He put one email out and then came back with another one. The vast majority of aircraft landing on runway 22 right, they exit, proceed down Alpha, and turn on to Quebec, which means they're putting themselves perpendicular than parallel, blocking the signal. Aircraft that execute a long rollout have to make relatively sharp turns into that area, probably undesirable to both the pilot and ATC. There you go. I mean, I don't know what else more they need from a technician or an engineer. This engineer here states, Battle Creek is where flight check is from. They talk about how they come in and flight check the equipment. However, they were flown in a clean environment, no aircraft on the runways or taxiways. In other words, I believe that there will have to protect the respective critical areas no matter what. In fact, I do not know at this time if the existing hold short lines are adequate to prevent what they're describing, and only considered what was happening close in near the segment, the final segment of the approach. So what he means by that are these critical area hold shorts. These ones are massive for these runways landing straight in. Look at the critical area for the offset. So he was voicing concerns about what we were protecting and where the lines were on the taxiway. That brought him consternation that he brought it up. And that was after all the issues back in 2015 that we already discussed. So that is it for this segment. We're going to move on to the next one here in a minute. So what we're going to look at now is from April of 2024. And the reason that I jumped forward because of something specifically they mentioned it here in their response to the special counsel. This is from the FA to the special counsel that month and year. And they were asking why they used a draft of the 2008 math modeling to make any determinations. But what the FA is not going to mention in here, there were two math modelings, one for the offset of runway 4 left and one for the offset of runway 22 right. The runway 4 left the draft status and became a document. Runway 22 right did not. It stayed in the draft positioning. So in the response to why they were using a draft post, 3 additional interviews, okay? Who were they? Position, title, and their documents. Nothing provided. With personnel previously interviewed for this investigation. Who? Because the people that we've already covered clearly didn't say any of the stuff that they saying was okay. And the principals and the specialists familiar with that draft post from 2008 were also involved. Although the draft document was reviewed out of abundance of caution, the final version discussed in the next paragraph, there was no final version of that particular draft for runway 22 right. And the next paragraph was one presented during the SRMP. Well, which one? They don't say which SRMP. The mitigations from the 2015 panel were deemed sufficient to ensure safety of the procedure and were incorporated into the SRMD document from 2018. And that validated the findings and mitigations from the 2015 document. That is not correct. None of the math modeling was presented at the 2015 panel. Was not. I was there. Never happened. So then go on to continue to talk about, now specifically runway 4 left. The math modeling study, and then it goes on ILS, blah, 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 runway 4 left localizer, was an engineering study produced in accordance with sighting criteria for ILSs. That has nothing to do with it. The math modeling had nothing to do with that sighting criteria. I looked into that sighting criteria. Nothing was mentioned about any math modelings. That's just where to put it at and make sure it's placed correctly. FA Engineering Services, who was present during the SRMP, I'm assuming 2018, used this document, which contains localizer antenna sighting criteria. No, it wasn't. There was no documentation there like that. And I'll let you know why here in a second. The panel was informed results of the study indicated the localizer sighting criteria was met or within tolerance. We are not discussing sighting criteria. We are talking about math modeling taxiing through the ILS critical area, the localizer critical area for runway 22 right and 4 left. We never discussed sighting. But on top of that, not only was this information not there because 2 of the people there, when I asked them about it, said, no, that wasn't there, but this document was. From May of 2018, the same month as that panel, talking about closely spaced parallel operations and all that. And they start off talking about all of runway configurations fall within bounds of the generic cases except for Detroit, O'Hare, Kennedy, Denver, and Seattle. Additional scenarios were created and evaluated at these 5 airports due to the uniqueness of the configurations, which were offset localizers. And the funny thing is, Detroit's the only airport that taxi through their critical area. The other ones do not. And they talk about the placement of the antennas. But then they make an interesting statement. Approaches to runway 22 left and 22 right utilize an offset localizer to runway 22 right, of course. However, due to signal interference from taxiing aircraft, straight-in approaches were evaluated in this study. They never even evaluated the offset localizers at Detroit. Never did it. Says so right here. Only the straight-ins were. So what are these people talking about? They're saying all these documents were presented in 2018. This was the only document presented in 2018. Because if there was something more than that, they would have provided it. They never did. They make all these statements, but never provide any documentation. They weren't even correct on which runway it was. So this makes no sense to me at all. Why they would make these statements, throw these red herrings out, write such a poorly 2 or 3 paragraphs here, knowing that this document is out there, knowing all the documents and emails from 2011 and 2 lists in 2018. And there are no issues. There's no safety concerns. It just doesn't make any sense. I've proven numerous ones from them, things I never even generated. They gave us all this information, and yet they're ignoring what their technicians and engineers are giving to them. So we'll move on to the next document. Now we're going to roll in to the math modeling. This is for runway 4 left. You can see it's a document, August 26th of 2008. That's what they mentioned in the last report. And right out of the gate, this is what they state. Additional modeling of the Boeing 737, Boeing 777 airframes resulted in significant reductions in course oscillations in comparison to the Boeing 747. But those results remained well outside acceptable limits. Again, how is Mr. Voss able to keep making these statements of, there's nothing, he's making these up, they're manufactured safety issues, and engineers are saying what I'm saying, they're supporting what I'm trying to prove. Then they continue with, the results present a prediction of the impact of taxiing aircraft on the runway 4 left offset ILS approach. The reader must note the alignment tolerance does not address stability, course stability, which is something that Mr. Vosser has mentioned in his hotline call against me, that they're on a stable approach. How does he know that? Wasn't even spoke about. But you'll see that there are much worse things than this. Rather, it addresses the alignment accuracy required at threshold. The magnitude, duration, and rate of oscillation may introduce excessive need fluctuations in the cockpit, and autopilot unlocks during coupled approaches. That is why the radar room is required to call the tower and say, aircraft so-and-so is going to do an auto land because of this. But it's safe, right? Now we go on to the runway 22 right math modeling for the offset. Draft. Never left the draft status. Never did. And this has some interesting information in it. It basically makes one of the same statements that they just made. It is noted that both the Boeing 737 and 757 class frames are not predicted to produce out of tolerance conditions, despite the fact that they would cause significant needle deflections that would be unwelcome in the cockpit. The results of this effort produced one point where the localizer alignment exceeded 3 times the available tolerance. Unwelcome in a cockpit, right? Just as long as we don't impact the capacity and efficiency of the airport, this stuff is okay. It truly is to them. Now, this is an interesting statement that goes back to the critical area being so small and what that one engineer had stated about they don't think that we're protecting a large enough area. Counterintuitively, the greatest impact to the signal occurs at the location further from the array, though the signal excursions at both locations would result in rapid and unacceptable course swings. Now, that would explain when we're having issues with nobody in that critical area, when these pilots are reporting those things, right here. That would explain that. And that's what the concern was of that engineer, that we're not protecting a large enough area at the time. Then up here, they go on to talk about how they enter the critical area in a straight in and an offset. The wavering will typically be characterized by a swing to first one side and then to another side before returning to center. Swings with a range of movement as little as 10 microamps may be observable in the cockpit and present an unwanted distraction to pilots during a critical phase of flight. In addition, slow swings may be tracked by an autopilot, and the aircraft maneuvers to chase the localizer centerline signal lateral separation will be altered. And that means when they're coming in on the offset, the gentleman off their left or right, depending on which way they're coming in. That's an issue. That's what he's talking about. We ignored that. We don't have to tell anybody about this. That's why the FAA doesn't give these documents in their responses, because what they're saying right here. Unwanted distraction of pilots during a critical phase of flight. Mr. Vossers mentions in his hotline call against me in 2015, oh, they're on a stable approach. Does any of this sound like a stable approach at this point? Why is he and others ignoring all this? Unbelievable. Then they go on to state, the runway 22 right offset critical area should be protected at all times for large aircraft, to include the Boeing 757 and similar size airframes. We're not doing that. Operational experience may result in broadening this recommendation to include additional aircraft if pilot reports signal fluctuations are received. No, it didn't do that. Even though they were receiving all those fluctuations that we covered earlier, no, we're not going to do that. No, we're going to ignore that. We're going to lower the minimums for the approach. We're going to ignore all the forecasting and weather at the airport. So this was in a draft form, never went out. I wonder why. So everything up to this point that we're talking about for the math modeling is totally opposite of what Mr. Vossers is talking about and everybody else. Oh, it's safe to use. Well, we're the only ones that have an offset and taxi through the critical area. Oh, all these other airports use them. Yeah, but they don't do what Detroit does. I mean, look at this data. It's unbelievable. Lateral separation will be altered. A radar room controller isn't concerned about that. And now they're doing it again when they started on July 28th in crappy weather, when they had numerous issues in poor weather. Yet they just said, oh, wait, those don't count. Those are, we don't know what you're talking about. That stuff, we'll just ignore it. We'll ignore guys going through the localizer. We'll ignore guys that are reporting these issues. Hey, we did this big educational thing for this, and we're still getting these anomalies. Well, it has to be the pilots. Oh, when something happens, why didn't the tower do this? Why didn't the radar room do this? Why didn't this controller do this? Blaming everybody but themselves. And I think it's such a dereliction of duty to allow this to happen. For so long, look what happened at DCA. Those controllers complained about all those near mid-airs, and they went to their superiors about it. They ignored it. It's going to happen again if they continue with this attitude, totally negating any safety issues whatsoever, so they can keep the stakeholders and the user happy. Capacity, then efficiency, then safety. I'll move on to the next document. This document we're going to cover now is a briefing guide from a verbal briefing from management to the tower controllers. They talk about the closure plan, that this runway is closing, so they're going to be doing the ILSs of both of these runways, this one utilizing the offset. So they start off with this, the visual approaches title. They're stating that regardless of weather conditions, they're going to use the Yankee offset localizer, unless weather is forecast to drop below the approach minimums of 300.5. The next part here on page 1. Aircraft following a heavy arrival will not be cleared for the ILS approach until the heavy has exited the ILS critical area. Well, nobody knows how that's going to be accomplished. They were not instructed to call the TRACON and the radar room and say, hey, the heavy's out of the critical area. They do have a ground display, a radar display, in the radar room. And to my knowledge, the controllers there have never been certified nor received any training on it. And the understanding I also have is that is not maintained, like the displays in the tower, the ground displays in the tower. So that's an issue. Then it goes on to state, note, aircraft following a heavy may be cleared for an alternate approach, which will be indicated on a scratch pad. Why not just run the alternate approach? Just to start off with, then there's no issues. They could run an GPS RNAV with no critical area, offset, no critical area. They could run straight into both runways, so both west parallels, with a 1 mile staggered, no critical area. They do now have approaches published, and the rules changed for Detroit to be able to run straight in, side by side, to both of the western runways utilizing PM approaches. Straight in, Zulu, they're approved, they're published. They're not doing that. So the other odd thing is they're going to run the offset with a 1 mile staggered under instrument approaches. Well, if they're running a 1 mile staggered, why don't they just run the staggered with straight in approaches and run the staggered there? It's the same thing. That doesn't make any sense. And what else doesn't make any sense is, again, this paragraph here about the heavy. Because down here, and I'll do more in depth on page 2 here in a moment, but they use this verbiage describing the same thing. When a heavy aircraft is on approach to runways 4 left, 22 right, the succeeding arrival will not be cleared for the ILS Yankee approach until the heavy aircraft has taxied clear of the ILS critical area, or it must be sequenced to a parallel runway. Well, this verbiage here is kind of more in line with what the FAA told the special counsel in April of 2024. And they state it right here. It's about the same, but the verbiage isn't exact. When a heavy aircraft is on approach to runways, when a heavy aircraft is operating to 4 left, 22 right. So this is from the LOA, and it was effective June 1st, 2021. All they had to do is cut and paste this. And they can't do that right because the verbiage is different. So different verbiage, 2 different pages that doesn't match the LOA. That's pretty embarrassing. But let's just move on to page 2. So we'll continue on to page 2. D21, TRACON, radar room, will take the following actions. Runway 22 left, 4 right breakouts. Turn away from the adjacent final if you can avoid overflying runway 21 right, 3 left, which could have a departure rolling. So what they're basically saying there is, if there's something wrong with that offset on a 22 right or 4 left, and they start drifting into that airplane off there, left or right, depending on which direction they're landing, they want to break out and turn away from that airplane, which they should be doing. But they don't need to be asking 20 questions. They're worried about what the tower is doing with their departure off runway 21 right or 3 left. They need to move that airplane away from the one that's encroaching on them. So they don't have time to call the tower, hey, do you have a departure rolling? And they're concerned about overflying the runway. What about what sector he's going to be going into? Is there somebody climbing into him below? There's a litany of things that can happen. But for them just to say, well, maybe they have a departure rolling, those guys don't have time in the radar room to be messing with that. Those airplanes are so close together. But if you can't accomplish a turn, then we need to climb straight ahead to 4,000. Okay, so let's say that the breakout isn't due to an encroachment from the offset localizer side. Let's say he's catching the airplane in front of him. Well, historically, what you want to do is give a clearing turn, left or right, depending on which way they're landing, to get divergence so you can climb. And since you have divergence behind the airplane, you can have less than 3 miles and less than 1,000 feet. But if you tell the guy to climb straight ahead and he starts accelerating before he can climb, you could still lose the separation between the trailing aircraft and the one he's following. So that then introduces another issue. So this is it's not written very well. It really, matter of fact, to me, the whole document, it looks like it's cut and pasted. They have things underneath subtitles and titles that really don't fit there. But this here, the whole breakout thing is very poorly thought through. And then it goes on to talk about the heavy aircraft again, landing on the offset runway. So why this is under breakouts and all that, I have no idea. But it's different verbiage. When a heavy aircraft is on approach to runways 4 left, 22 right, that's exceeding arrival will not be cleared for the ILS approach until the heavy aircraft is taxied clear of the ILS critical area. Basically, the same issues come up, but the first time they use it on page 1. But it's kind of funny because they add this to the end of it. It must be sequenced to a parallel runway. There's only one parallel runway, and that's the one off their east side. So for one, does that mean they're going to break them out and bring them back through? Or are they never going to clear for the approach and have them set up for that, which takes a while for the pilot to brief in the cockpit. They're not going to certainly just take them off that file and put them on the other one. So again, the two different sets of rules on two different pages. And then they pop the weather requirement here in the note, the bottom of this one here. So this is kind of odd because I don't know where they cut and pasted it from. Because the agency over the years has changed this to heavy, to high profile, to high-tailed aircraft, and they've changed this quite a bit, and they put two different verbiage covering the exact same thing on two different pages. So this is very, very poorly written, and I would imagine it was very poorly conveyed. So now we go to the tower staffing recommendations, and again, the word recommendations is used, and they use words like should, could, would, and what they're trying to accomplish here is to the maximum extent possible, DTW should staff 3 locals during PRM approaches. Well, should. Well, if memory serves me correct, for PRMs, you have to have a separate local working those runways. And again, this was never vetted for 2 runways, it was vetted for 3 runways. So the issue was that you're always going to have a local working runway 22 right, 4 left, 4 right, 22 left, and 21 left, 3 right, to avoid frequency congestion and people walking on each other. Right? So that's what they're saying here. You should staff that. If staffing becomes an issue, suspend training. Okay, well, all right, fine. And then there's controllers that were training or being trained. If they're certified somewhere else, you could put them somewhere else in the tower to support the mission, which means the user and the shareholders or stakeholders. I can't remember what word they used. The second step could be to combine flight data, clearance delivery to ground control. Okay, so let's say they can only have 1 ground controller, even 2 for that matter. It doesn't matter. Why is ground control working flight data clearance delivery when they should be looking out the window? Because here's why it becomes more important. During triple approaches, they load up the easternmost and the westernmost runway, and that middle runway they only put maybe 7 or 8 on. Now they're going from that to loading up both of those runways. And they're going to be coming off those runways pretty quickly. And they're going to be taken all over the airport. So ground control is going to be working more airplanes in a concentrated area. So why they would want to combine that position up with flight data clearance delivery, who, by the way, flight data clearance delivery is responsible for the weather. So now you're making the ground controller responsible to catch the weather and disseminate it. And if it's a weather that puts the ceiling or visibility below those requirements for the critical area, he needs to notice that, because I'm going to jump to the bottom here. The primary objective would have at least 3 locals and a standalone supervisor or CIC at the desk. They're not allowed to combine anything up to that desk. So flight data is going to have to be worked by this controller. The supervisor can't, because they are restricted from doing that. So that is going to cause a litany of issues. He should be looking out that window as a ground controller. The third position that they want to take on this would be to have local northeast, the runway being where the departures come off of, being controlled by a single controller, take control of runway 22 left, which is the straight-in one, with the associated frequency, and work 22 left arrivals and 21 right departures during this arrival bank with departures. So it's kind of confusing that DCA had their scenario where they were complaining about why was that controller working 2 frequencies? Why was he working combined? And that was one of the reasons why you have a separate controller for each of those runways, so they don't walk on each other in poor weather and in a critical operation, PRMs. Now they're saying it's okay to do that, provided that this doesn't impact the user or the shareholder or stakeholder, whatever they're called. Yeah, go ahead and do this. So they keep whittling away at those safety nets for safety. These are the things they complain about at DCA. Arrival banks run for 45 minutes. Really? These modified stances should only be used for a short period of time. 45 minutes with all those airplanes is a pretty long period of time. So they want to be able to do these things, make it more unsafe, so you don't impact the user. Why are they doing that? Look what happened in DCA. These are the things that they're complaining about in DCA, and they're moving forward with this. These things were never discussed during any of the panels, that this is what was going to happen. There are very specific mitigations. Now they're just ignoring another mitigation. Now, I could be wrong on that, but I'm almost positive that was the issue. So I'm really not sure why they were allowed to do this. I find it very hard to believe that this was not sent outside the facility before it was authorized to be briefed to the controllers, because there are a number of things in here that raise a lot of red flags. Anyhow, let's move to the conclusion. Well, there you have it again. The allowing safety to be chipped away over so many years is just asking for something to happen. Mr. Sujan doesn't have any evidence that this is happening. I showed you a ton of evidence that I received from the agency in 2018. They were keeping it from the tower and the people on that panel with them deliberately and complicitly. And then when I found out about it and called them out on it, they didn't care. And I think this all goes back to 2007. You can knowingly run the Southwest Flow operation. You could knowingly lie to Congress, and nothing's going to happen to you. So why would anything change from 2010 or so on forward with the offset localizer? Doing the exact same things. Well, we talked to this guy. We talked to these guys. And then insulting the people that actually wrote things that were against what they wanted to do. They insulted them. Oh, we have to have somebody else look at this. And then when they say that somebody else looked at this and it was fine, no names, no titles, no positions, no documents. And I have all those documents with the people that are saying them. I redacted them out because I don't want anybody to go after them or contact them, but they specifically wrote things. And look at all the things that were uncovered. Look what I found. They were upset. They got caught with their hand in a cookie jar. Why would you not tell your fellow controls in the tower room what was going to happen? And then say, there's no evidence. And then here, meanwhile, management was the one that did all that evidence and gave it to me. I didn't send that to AAE for the 2015 hotline call against me and others, my recruits. That was given to them when they asked for it from the facility. So then what happens is, well, look at all these issues. And then as this went on, and the special counsel says to the FAA, hey, you have to give us information on anything involving that Yankee offset localizer. And what do? They don't do it. Well, we didn't have to because. Well, what happened to the controllers that were working in 2015 that would tell their supervisors these were issues? Right? The controllers are working, and they're not saying anything to anybody. Supervisors are monitoring the situation in the radar room. They're not making any log entries over it. We have controls in the tower that are being repeatedly told, hey, we have issues over a 13-minute period, I think 4 or 5 issues, with the technicians on a telephone. Not one log entry was made. That way, they don't have to report anything to anybody. And I happen to find that. So they're saying, oh, there's no issues. No, you're not reporting issues. You're not tracking them properly. You're not investigating them properly. So this is ridiculous given what happened in DCA and what they said. Hey, we told management about this, but they ignored us. And like that operations manager said out of DCA, oh, that accident didn't occur that night. This was a long time coming over things not being addressed. Now, there was a lot to cover in this, and I just want to make sure I mention the airlines' access and influence with the agency is at an absolute unacceptable level. These people that don't look at this empirical data and believe it are like flat earthers. They just ignore it because they don't understand it, or they don't want to understand it because it impacts capacity and efficiency, then safety. The flying public is being endangered. The pilots and controllers in that tower are being put in horribly compromised positions, which has been shown. And in writing, it's been shown that it was going to happen. And the other thing that really bothered me when I was recording this is one of the things that Tracy Gillen and Anthony Wells said, well, can't we just advise the pilots there's somebody in there? Well, if he's at the final approach fix or inside of it, and you just want to advise them, why not just never have the critical area and just tell every pilot, you're clear to land, aircraft are going to be taxiing through the critical area when it's below 802. Why not just do that? That's not what the rule was set up for. And again, I'm not a big fan of Mr. Grammas, but he absolutely nailed that perfectly. He really did. And they're ignoring it once again. So there you have it. Another set of documents that are just poorly written from the titles to the subtitles, two different verbiage for two different two different verbiage for the same scenario. I just don't understand what they're thinking there. That document is very confusing. Too many young controllers and new soups up there that have never done this are going to be hung out to dry. I'm not going to allow that to happen, because something is going to happen, and I have more than enough documentation to prove that, leading up to this document that was just used during a verbal briefing. I really hope that they make the right decision. Stop using that offset localizer. Use GPSs. Use the Zulu PRM straight-ins. Use staggered approaches. Something other than they're doing. It's highly unprofessional and derelict. And when something happens, they'll know exactly who to point the finger at. And after what happened in DCA, nobody's listening at Detroit. You take care, and I'm going to put one out later on in the week. Good night.